The nameplate beside the door of Oakshore Cottage had not been changed in 9 months, and that small fact said everything about the woman who lived behind it. Dr. Thomas Oakshore, it read, in letters that had once meant something in this corner of the Yorkshire Dale. A man who rode out at midnight for croup, who packed his bag without complaint when the Deaston children took fever, who charged nothing to those who had nothing, and asked only that his patients live. He had died in February, quietly, in the same upstairs room where he had set 400 broken arms and watched 100 fevers break. His daughter Maria had nursed him through it, and when it was done, she had taken the nameplate down from its hook, cleaned it with a cloth, and hung it back in exactly the same spot. It was not sentiment exactly. It was more the understanding that the plate was a kind of contract with the Dale, and that she intended to keep his half of it, whether anyone asked her to or not. Maria Oakshore was 24 years old that October, and she had her father's hands, broad across the knuckle, precise at the fingertip, the kind of hands that knew the difference between a pulse that was merely quick and one that was frightened. She had also inherited his leather bag, a heavy, battered thing of oxhide darkened with years of use, fitted with a brass clasp that no longer quite caught, so that she had taken to tying it with a length of waxed cord. Inside it lived the instruments and remedies she had catalogued after the funeral, with the same careful methodicalness she brought to everything. The lancet in its bone case, the curved needle and its spool of silk thread, the small blue bottle of laudanum, the linen bandages she rolled herself on Sunday evenings. The bag sat beside the kitchen door, on a low shelf her father had built for exactly that purpose, at a height a person could grab without bending. It was always ready. That, too, was a kind of inheritance. The rain that had come down on the Dale since Thursday was not ordinary Yorkshire rain. It was the kind of rain that has a purpose, that arrives out of the north with the deliberate character of a creditor, settling in, finding every gap in the thatch, filling the ditch at the foot of the lane until the lane ceased to be a lane and became instead a brown and muscular river threading between the hedgerows. The beck at Collie Ford had broken its banks on the second night. By Saturday morning, the lower fields of 3 farms lay under a foot of water, and the road to the village of Harthwick, the road that connected Maria's world to anything beyond the hills, ran brown and swollen between the stone walls, as though the whole Dale had been upended like a pail. Maria was pressing a linen shirt when Mrs. Trevik came in from the yard, her shawl plastered flat to her shoulders, her boots leaving dark prints across the flagstones, her face carrying the expression of a woman who has just encountered something that requires immediate and competent attention. "There's a carriage over at Collie Ford," Mrs. Trevik said, without preamble, because she knew the sort of woman she worked for. "Henry Sowerby came by the far track, says it's a fine travelling chaise, turned clean over in the flood. A coachman and a gentleman by the looks. He didn't stop, said the gentleman wasn't moving." Maria set the iron down on its trivet with a careful click. She looked at the window, where the rain ran in continuous grey sheets against the glass. She said nothing for a moment, not from indecision, but from the brief, internal arithmetic of someone calculating what will be needed and whether it is present. "Send Sam," she said. "Tell him to ride to Featherwick for Dr. Ambrose, but tell him to go the high track, not through Collie Ford, and fetch my bag." Mrs. Trevik's son Samuel was 17, lean, and possessed of the particular combination of confidence and recklessness that makes young men either very useful or very dangerous in an emergency. He appeared in the doorway with the bag already in his hands. He had heard through the wall, as he always did, and Maria took it from him, checked the clasp by reflex, retied the cord an inch tighter against the wet. She pulled her heaviest wool cape from the hook beside the door. She picked up the lantern from the shelf and lit it from the kitchen fire, sheltering the flame with her palm against the draught that crept under the door. "Sam," she said as he turned to go, "if Ambrose cannot come, do not ride back empty-handed. Ride to Kettlesworth and find whoever is there. Someone will come." He nodded, already past the gate, and then he was gone into the rain, his horse's hoofbeats swallowed almost immediately by the general sound of water. Mrs. Trevik stood in the kitchen with her hands twisted in her apron, looking at the door Maria had just walked through, and the lantern light diminished down the lane until it was a small, warm point in a great deal of dark. The lane between Oakshaw Cottage and Collie Ford was a quarter-mile on a dry day. That evening, in the wet and the early dark, it was something else entirely. Maria knew every step of it, knew the place where the root of the old ash had worked up through the surface, knew the gate that sagged to the left and would catch an unwary foot. And still the walk was a kind of ordeal. The mud pulled at her boots with each step, a soft, relentless sucking that made every stride cost twice what it ought. The rain found the gap between her cape and her collar and ran down the back of her neck in a thin, merciless thread. The smell of October floodwater reached her, cold earth, rotting leaves, something organic and faintly sweet that she had learned, in years of following her father out in bad weather, to register without investigating. Overhead, the trees tossed in the wind, and the sound they made was the sound of something large and indifferent turning in its sleep. The lantern held, though the flame shrank to a blue thread in the gusts, and twice she thought she had lost it. She kept it at arm's length and slightly ahead of her, so that the light fell forward on the track, and she walked with her chin down and the leather bag pressed to her ribs. And she did not hurry, because hurrying in that mud would only put her face down in the ditch. Hurrying never helped anyone who arrived too injured to work. Her father had told her that on her first night call, when she was 12, and he had let her carry the bag for the first time, and she had never found occasion to disagree. She heard the horse before she saw the carriage, a low, distressed sound that cut through the rain. The kind a horse makes when it is not hurt but frightened and cannot understand what has happened to the familiar ground. Then the lantern caught the pale underside of the chaise, tipped onto its side in the verge where the road dipped toward the ford, one wheel still moving faintly in the current, the whole vehicle listing at an angle that told her immediately that the front axle had gone. A man sat propped against the carriage body, cradling his right arm with his left. He was perhaps 50, heavy-set, wearing a coachman's coat that was by now more water than wool. His face, in the lantern light, had the taut and pallid look of a man who has been managing a specific pain for an hour or more. "Harker," said a voice from the far side of the carriage. "Harker, answer her." The man looked up at Maria with the expression of someone for whom surprise is no longer accessible. "The shoulder," he said. "Went out when I came down with the box." "Don't move it," Maria said, and set the lantern in the fork of the hedgerow, where the hedge was thickest and would hold it. She came around the front of the chaise, following the voice. He was lying with his back against the road bank, his legs out before him, his dark coat soaked through, and his hat gone entirely. There was blood on the right side of his face, a cut above the brow, not deep enough to be mortal, but producing the spectacular quantity of blood that brow cuts always produce, painting the whole side of his face a dark red that the rain was slowly running pale. He was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately place. Not the dull incomprehension of a man badly injured, not fear, but something alert and considering, as though he was taking careful note of everything, including her. "How long have you been here?" Maria asked, already opening the bag. "An hour, perhaps a little more." His voice was low and controlled, the voice of a man managing himself from the inside. "I sent Harker to stop traffic from attempting the ford. No one has come through." She pressed a fold of clean linen against the cut, held it firm. He did not flinch. She watched his pupils in the lantern light, even, tracking, responding correctly to the shift of the flame. His breathing was steady. Whatever had landed him against that bank had not scrambled anything important. "Your name," she said. A pause. Barely a pause, the length of a deliberate breath. A beat she would not have caught if she had not been watching his face. And then, "Roland," he said. "I am Roland." She noted it, not the name itself, but the half-second that preceded it, and stored it carefully in the part of her mind that had always, quietly, kept accounts. She was not a woman who repeated a question in an emergency. There were more pressing matters, and the pressing matters had names she already knew. A bleeding brow, a dislocated shoulder, a horse that needed calming, and no surgeon within 6 miles in weather that was, if anything, worsening. She called to Harker to come around. He came stiffly, his right arm held rigid against his side, with the careful immobility of someone who has learned by experiment exactly where the pain begins. Maria examined the shoulder with both hands, feeling the displaced head of the joint against the wrong side of the socket, and Harker submitted with the particular stoicism of a man who has decided that stoicism is the only remaining option available to him. "It's out of the socket," she said. "I can put it back, but it will hurt considerably before it stops hurting." Harker considered this with the gravity it deserved. "How considerably?" he asked. "Considerably," Maria said, and the precision of the repetition was its own full answer. He looked at her for a moment in the lantern light, taking her measure the way a sensible man takes the measure of whatever is about to cause him significant pain. Then he said, "Go on then." She had watched her father do this procedure twice, and done it herself once, on a farmhand who had fallen from a hay frame in the Deaston barn 3 summers back. She planted her right foot against Harker's ribs, not roughly, but with a firm, specific pressure, a fulcrum, and took his wrist in both hands and began the slow rotation outward and back. Not a sharp pull, never a sharp pull, her father's voice instructed from somewhere near the back of her memory, steady and continuous, like drawing a cork from a bottle that has been sealed a long time. She felt the resistance build, and then, with a sound exactly like a large knuckle cracked against the edge of a table, the shoulder went back where it belonged. Harker let out a breath that contained, somewhere inside it, a laugh. He moved the arm experimentally, stopped, moved it again, and the laugh became something more genuine. "My God," he said. He looked at her with an expression balanced precisely between gratitude and genuine wonder. "You're the best surgeon in the north, miss." "I am the only surgeon within 6 miles at present," Maria said, which was accurate, and began binding the arm to his body with a long strip of linen to hold the joint still against the walk-back. The man who called himself Roland had watched the whole of it without speaking. Now, as Maria returned to him and threaded the curved needle with the methodicalness of long practice, silk thread pulled through twice, a habit she had taken from her father and never thought to question, she was aware of his attention in a way that was different from the ordinary self-consciousness of a patient waiting for a needle. Most people, when they saw it being prepared, looked away at the fire or the sky or anywhere that was not the approaching point. He did not look away. He watched her hands. She stitched the cut in 5 passes, each one small and even, the needle moving under the lantern light, with the unhurried precision of work done often enough to have become a kind of knowledge that lives in the fingers rather than the mind. She tied each knot the way her father had taught her, twice round, pull flat, not tight enough to pucker. The rain had eased to something merely persistent, or she had stopped registering it. The smell of wood smoke from the cottage drifted down the lane on the wind, and she became aware, peripherally, that her hands were cold enough to have lost some of their fine feeling, and that she had been out in the wet for the better part of an hour. "Can you walk?" she asked, cutting the final thread. Roland looked at his legs with a faint expression of assessment. "Yes," he said, and proved it by rising, carefully, but without assistance, and remaining steadily upright once he had found his feet. "Then you'll both come in," Maria said. The road won't be passable tonight. Nothing will be until the water drops. She did not ask whether this arrangement suited him. She picked up the leather bag, reclaimed the lantern from the hedgerow, and started back toward the cottage, without looking behind her to see whether he followed. He did. She heard his footfall in the mud, slightly heavier than Harker's, a measured tread, and the particular quality of silence that surrounded him. The silence of a man who was watching the back of a woman's head, and thinking thoughts he had not yet decided whether to speak. In the kitchen, with the kettle over the heat, and Harker settled in the high-backed chair by the fire, with his bound arm, and a cup of broth, and the beginning of a deep and well-earned sleep, Maria finally had the occasion to look properly at the man who had given her only a Christian name, and a pause. He sat where she directed him, not with the automatic compliance of someone accustomed to being told where to go, but with the deliberate cooperation of a person who has chosen, for reasons of his own, that compliance is the correct policy for this particular moment. He was perhaps 30, or a year or two past it. His dark coat, now that it was beginning to dry near the fire, revealed itself unmistakably as extremely fine wool, cut close at the shoulder in a manner that belonged to no steward's wardrobe, no agent's, no working man's she had ever dressed a wound for. But he offered no explanation for it, and she did not press him, because the fire was warm and the rain loud on the roof tiles, and there was broth enough for three. She set his cup in front of him. He accepted it with both hands, looked at it for a moment, and then looked at her, directly, without the sidelong quality that most people brought to the business of looking at someone they were trying to understand without being caught at it. There was something in that directness that Maria found, against her better judgment, restful. Most people looked at her slantwise. Most people had, since the funeral, found some polite way to arrange their faces into a shape that communicated sympathy without requiring them to remain in the room. Roland simply looked at her, as though she were an interesting problem he intended to think about carefully before reaching any conclusions. Mrs. Trevick had retired by 9 with characteristic tact, pausing only to set a second candle on the mantel and inform Maria, in a tone that managed to be both neutral and entirely pointed, that the spare room was made up and the bolster was fresh. Harker had been moved to the settle and covered with the horse blanket from the hall, and had given himself over to sleep with the thoroughness of a man whose body has decided that consciousness is no longer necessary or desirable. This left Maria and Roland on opposite sides of the kitchen hearth, with the fire between them and the rain against the window, and a silence that was not uncomfortable precisely, but that had a texture to it. The texture of two people who have been through something together and have not yet agreed on what it means. Maria had changed into dry clothes, plain grey wool, and plaited her hair back without ceremony. She was aware of this in the way she was aware of most things about herself, as information, not as apology. She poured the last of the broth into her own cup and sat in the wooden chair that had been her father's, the one with the worn patch on the left armrest where his elbow had rested for 30 years, and opened the account ledger she kept for the household, because there were figures that needed attending to, and the evening was otherwise going to require conversation. "You did that very well," Roland said from across the hearth. She did not look up. "I have done it before." Harker's shoulder. Not many people would have known the method. Fewer still would have done it with that kind of steadiness. He paused. "You learned from your father." She did look up then. Not sharply, but with the particular attention of someone hearing their property mentioned without permission. "What makes you think my father taught me?" "The bag," he said. "The way you check the clasp and retie the cord each time you pick it up. That is a habit someone taught you, not one you arrived at yourself. And the nameplate on the door says doctor, not doctor and daughter." There was a long enough pause that the fire cracked twice, and the candle on the mantel guttered in a draught. He died in February, Maria said, and looked back at her ledger. The numbers blurred slightly, and she looked at them until they stopped. He had been practicing in this dale for 31 years. I was his assistant for 10 of them. I am sorry, Roland said. He said it simply, without the machinery of social condolence that usually accompanied those words, no softening preface, no gentling qualifier, and Maria found, to her mild surprise, that the simplicity was better than the machinery. She received it without further comment, the way one receives something small and accurate. Roland stretched his legs toward the fire and turned his cup between his hands and looked at the flames with the settled attention of a man who was in no hurry and had, apparently, laid down whatever sense of urgency he had arrived with, along with the name he chose not to elaborate on. He was, Maria observed from beneath the edge of her attention, not at ease in the physical way that comfortable people are at ease, that loose, incurious ease of men who have never had occasion to be anywhere other than where they expected to be. His ease was more deliberate than that. He had arranged himself into calm. It was the gesture of someone for whom calm was a discipline rather than a condition. The first evening passed in that register. They spoke perhaps 50 words more before the fire burned low enough that continuing to sit beside it required effort rather than merely receiving its warmth. He asked about the dale, the farming patterns, the degree to which the lower fields flooded every year or only in exceptional wet autumns. She answered because the questions were genuine rather than polite, and because talking about the dale was talking about something she knew, which was always preferable to talking about herself. She asked once, obliquely, whether he had family expecting him. He said, with perfect composure, that his household would find him eventually, and changed the subject to the ash tree she had mentioned at the bend in the lane. The subject changed so smoothly that she was almost a full sentence into the new topic before she registered the navigation. Maria Oakshaw had been managing people who did not want to give her the full truth since she was 15 years old, and her father had sent her to take a history from a patient who was lying about how much he drank. So she recognised evasion in all its variants. She recognised it now, and she registered it, and she said nothing. There would be time. There was always time, when the road was flooded, and the night was long, and there was nowhere for anyone to go. The flood did not recede in the morning. If anything, by Sunday dawn the water at Collyford was higher, and Sam Trevick came back from Featherwick with the intelligence that the bridge at Stannerley had taken a stone from its parapet overnight, that Dr. Ambrose was already out on a call that would keep him until the following day at the earliest, and that the high track across Harthwick Moor was running a foot deep where it crossed the bog drains. He delivered all of this information with the careful thoroughness of a young man who understood that accurate reporting was the most useful thing he could contribute to the situation, and had prepared accordingly. Maria thanked him, sent him to rest, and relayed the news to Roland, who received it across the kitchen table with an expression she was starting to recognise. That particular calibration of stillness that meant he was adjusting to something, internally, while his face held its position. "Then I am your guest for a day or two longer," he said. "You and Harker," she said, and set a bowl of porridge in front of him, because it was available, and because a man with a head wound, however tidy, needed to eat. What followed was not a day she would have predicted. Roland, she had resolved to go on calling him that, since it was what he had offered, and pressing a man for a surname in his first 12 hours under her roof seemed more like interrogation than hospitality, proved entirely willing to be useful. He asked after the shutter on the north window of the back kitchen, which had been banging since Thursday because the upper hinge had pulled away from the frame. When Maria confirmed that yes, there was a hinge, it had been meaning to be fixed since the summer, he found the toolbox in the outhouse with a directness that suggested he had either looked for it quietly or was accustomed to knowing where things were in practical households. And by mid-morning, the shutter was sound. It was the sort of thing a steward might do, or a land agent, a man with hands-on knowledge of how houses worked. Maria told herself this, and found it adequate for the time being. Harker, his shoulder bound, and his dignity largely restored by a night's sleep and a large breakfast, was a different source of information entirely. Though he too, she noticed, maintained a careful silence on certain specific subjects. He told her, in the course of the morning, that he had been in service for 22 years, that his wife was a cook in a large house in the north, and that he had once set his own collarbone against a wall in a stable after a fall from a horse, because there was no one else available and the horse needed seeing to before any of the rest of it could matter. He had a broad Yorkshire directness and a dry humour and an affection for his employer that was visible in exactly the ways such men's affections for their employers always are. In the quality of attention he paid to the room whenever Roland moved, in the slight, unconscious alignment of his posture whenever the two of them were in proximity. He did not name his employer. He called him, with complete naturalness, himself, in the manner of a Yorkshireman of a certain generation for whom naming a person in his presence was slightly beside the point. Maria filed this too, beside the quality of the wool, beside the pause before the name, beside the ease with which Roland had navigated a kitchen he had never been in before, and found the tools and mended the shutter without being asked. On the second afternoon, a child appeared at the kitchen door. Robin Sowerby, 7 years old, son of the Henry Sowerby who had first brought word of the accident. His right hand wrapped in a cloth that his mother had tied, with insufficient confidence in what lay beneath it. His mother hovered at the gate in the rain, too uncertain of her welcome to come up the path, which told Maria something about how this family had managed their encounters with the previous medicine in this dale, and so she went to the gate herself and brought the mother in with the same matter-of-fact courtesy she brought to everything, and set them both at the kitchen table. The cloth came off. A splinter, substantial, 1/2 inch of hedge thorn driven deep into the meaty part of the thumb, and Robin sat very straight and very still in the way that small children sit when they are being very brave and want an adult to notice. Maria lit an extra candle and brought it close and picked up the thin-tipped forceps and worked with a patience that matched the child's bravery, angle for angle. No sudden moves, no false promises about whether it would hurt, no talk of how quickly it would be over. She told Robin instead about the winter a fox had walked into this very kitchen through an open door and sat down by the fire as though it owned the room. And the story required exactly the right number of seconds for the splinter to be extracted, held up to the candlelight, confirmed genuine, and disposed of. Roland, who had been mending the kitchen gate in the yard when they arrived, and had come in quietly with mud on his boots, stood near the far wall throughout. He did not crowd the table or insert himself into the proceedings, but he watched. Maria was aware of it, as she was aware of the additional candle, as a source of light in the room, doing its work without requiring comment. When it was done, Robin looked at the forceps, and then at Maria, with the thorough seriousness of a child who has been through a genuine ordeal and expects this to be acknowledged. "Will it leave a mark?" he asked. "A small one," Maria said. "Here." She touched the spot with the tip of her finger. "By spring, you'll have to remember very hard to find it." Robin considered this, decided it was satisfactory, and looked past Maria to Roland, with the unguarded curiosity of the very young. "Are you the new doctor?" he asked. "No," Roland said from across the kitchen. And then, with a quality in his voice that Maria caught and held, "I am not." There was a pause in which Robin absorbed this with equanimity, because the world of adults was full of things that were precisely what they seemed not to be, and Robin was 7 and had already understood this. Mrs. Sowerby gathered her son and offered thanks with the slightly overwhelmed sincerity of a woman who had been more frightened than she showed, and Maria walked them to the gate. And when she came back into the kitchen, Roland was standing at the window with a cup in his hands and an expression on his face that he had not quite managed to compose before she re-entered the room. She recognized the expression, or rather she recognized its territory. It was the face of someone confronted with a simple and specific goodness. Not an abstract virtue, but the concrete, witnessed kind. The kind that has fingertips and takes time, and who finds that it costs him something to receive it. A tenderness turned against itself. Maria had seen it on her father's face sometimes, at the end of a long day, when he thought he was not being observed. She did not name it. She put the kettle on. The days settled into a pattern that had the quality of something improvised but surprisingly functional. The way emergency arrangements sometimes are, cleaner, somehow, than the lives they interrupt. Roland had found, on the second day, that the flagstone beside the hearth was cracked through and rocking on an uneven foundation, and had relaid it with a piece of flat shale from the garden wall, and a patience with the levelling that had occupied most of a morning. Mrs. Trevik had observed this without comment, which was her highest form of approval. Harker, his arm still bound but improving, had taken over the horses and had, with the 2 beasts from the chaise added to Maria's elderly cob, made the small stable a considerably more complex establishment, which he managed with the air of a man who has found his natural habitat and intends to stay there. In the evenings, after supper, Maria read aloud. It was a habit from her father's time. He had been going blind in his last year, enough that the fine print of the books he loved had defeated him, and she had read to him each night from whatever they were working through, which that winter had been Cowper's Letters and The Vicar of Wakefield, and a natural history of the Yorkshire Dales that she had bought him for Christmas. She had continued the habit after his death, not consciously as tribute, but because stopping had not suggested itself, because a kitchen with a fire and a book and a voice reading was a version of a room she needed to go on living in. Roland listened without performing the act of listening. He did not lean forward and demonstrate attention in the way that guests sometimes did when they felt they were receiving a benefit and wished to signal their gratitude for it. He simply settled into the chair, his long hands loose in his lap, and let the words come at him. And Maria, from behind the pages, watched him receive it with the peripheral precision she brought to all observation. On the third evening, she read from Gilbert White's Natural History, a passage about the migratory habits of swifts. And when she paused to turn the page, Roland said, without looking up, that he had seen a colony of swifts nesting in the stonework above the east face of a building he knew, and that they returned every year to the exact same stones, and that the building's caretaker had once been instructed to clear the nests for reasons of maintenance, but had quietly refused. Who instructed him? Maria asked. Roland paused with the same half-breath she had registered on the night they met. A person of some authority in the matter, he said, carefully. And the caretaker defied this authority, Maria said. And the swifts returned. Every spring, Roland said, for 11 years. It was the 4th evening when she said it. She had been turning it over since the first morning, examining it from different angles, the way she examined a wound before deciding how to approach it. Not urgently, but with the understanding that the approach mattered and should be chosen with care. She set the book down in her lap and looked at him across the fire. "You were not raised to be a steward," she said. Roland looked at her. The fire between them was lower than it had been an hour ago, the room darker at its edges. And in that light, his face had the quality of something seen clearly, precisely because the surrounding detail had been reduced. He did not pretend not to understand her. He did not look away. "No," he said, after a moment. "I was not." The silence that followed was the kind that contains a great deal more than silence. Maria waited in it with the patience of a woman who has sat beside enough beds in the dark to know the difference between a silence that is finished and one that is still working. I have been. He stopped, looked at his hands, then back at her. I am not accustomed to being in a place where what I am told about myself is not known in advance. Maria thought about this carefully, which he seemed to understand because he waited. And is that useful? She asked. Being unknown? Another pause, longer. The fire settled with a soft collapse of coals, and the room brightened briefly, and then dimmed. I had not expected to find out how useful, he said, until I found myself here. Maria looked at him for a moment longer, then picked the book back up and found her page. The candle on the mantel had burned 3/4 down. Outside, the rain went on, and the water at Collie Ford went on rising. And the world beyond the hedge at the end of the lane remained, for the time being, entirely and mercifully elsewhere. She turned the page. She did not ask what he had meant, exactly. She already suspected she knew, and she was not yet, willing to have the answer confirmed and made solid and permanent and real. Because a real answer would require her to do something with it, and she was not prepared for what doing something with it would cost. She read. He listened. The fire burned down to ash, and neither of them spoke again before it did. The flood gave way over the course of 4 days, reluctantly, the way water always retreats from land it has decided briefly to claim, not all at once, but in a slow, grudging withdrawal, leaving behind the evidence of its visit in the sculpted mud of the verges and the pale tide line on the gateposts, and the drowned dock plants lying flat and dark on the flooded fields, like the remnants of some great correspondence written in vegetation and then thought better of. By the morning of the 12th day, the road to Stanley was passable again, and Henry Sowerby's boy came up the lane to say so, and the practical question that had been suspended for nearly a fortnight, the question of what happened next, could no longer be left hanging. Roland was already up when Maria came down that morning. He was standing in the yard with Harker, both of them looking at the sky with the shared and wordless assessment of men who have spent time outdoors and read weather from it out of habit. And whatever they saw confirmed the road report, because Roland turned when he heard the kitchen door, and his expression told her what it contained before he spoke. The bridge at Stanley will hold, he said. Harker thinks the axle can be managed as far as Ripon. I would have Sowerby look at the wheel first, Maria said. The near side forward, it was still partly in the current when I found you. The spokes may have swelled. A pause, small, but there. Yes, he said. Thank you. He said it as though it were two quite different things at once. They spent the morning in the practical occupations of departure. The chaise was examined by Henry Sowerby himself, who confirmed the wheel was sound, but recommended the axle greased before Ripon, which Harker did with the methodical competence he brought to everything mechanical. Mrs. Trevick packed food for the road without being asked, because she understood travelling men and cold November and the gap between here and wherever was next. Roland paid for the room and the food, with a frankness about money that had no self-consciousness to it. Not the careful dignity of a man who fears appearing too flush, and not the careless largesse of a man performing generosity. He simply settled the account, fairly, and thanked Mrs. Trevick by name. The moment of actual departure arrived the way such moments always do, a beat sooner than it feels prepared for. The horse already pulled round, and Harker already up on the box. Roland stood in the lane with his hat back in his hands and looked at Maria, who stood at the gate, and there was a quality to the looking that was not like the quality of any looking before it in those 12 days. It was the look of a man who has been somewhere he did not expect to find worth leaving, and who is calculating, without benefit of any useful answer, whether leaving is the correct decision. I will write, he said. Yes, Maria said, which was not agreement and not disbelief, but something more precise than either. The acknowledgement of an intention that she was willing to hold in reserve and see what it was made of. She watched the chaise take the bend at the lane's end. She watched until the sound of the wheels on the repaired road diminished to nothing, and the ordinary sound of the dale returned. The rooks in the ash trees, the beck still running high and quick over the stones, the wind off the moor carrying the first real cold of November. She went back inside. She put the kettle on. She sat in her father's chair with the account ledger open in her lap. The same ledger she had opened on the first evening when she had needed something to look at that was not him. And she looked at the numbers until they stopped meaning anything, and then until they started again. He did not write in the first week. She had not expected him to, exactly. Roads were still recovering, men of business had obligations. It was natural. She told herself these things with the precision of a woman constructing an argument she intends to believe. He did not write in the second week. The third arrived, and she stopped composing explanations for his silence. Because explanations require a foundation, and the foundation she had been standing on, a man who had said he would write, who had looked at her that way in the lane, who had watched her work for 12 days with a quality of attention that she was not prepared to have, meant nothing, was becoming, quietly and unstoppably, less solid underfoot. She delivered 3 babies that month, set 2 broken bones, treated a case of quinsy in the Deaston kitchen that required 3 visits over 5 days, and very nearly required that surgeon she had never managed to get for the first emergency. She wrote in her ledger and repaired the kitchen gate properly with iron fittings this time, and read her natural history in the evenings, and did not once, open the drawer of her father's desk where she had placed the small, folded piece of paper on which Roland had written in a clear and considered hand only the words which she had not shown to Mrs. Trevik and did not intend to show to anyone. I am grateful for every hour. The drawer remained closed. The drawer's being closed was itself a kind of information, which she did not examine. The letter, when it came, was not from him. It arrived on a Tuesday in the second week of December, carried by a private messenger in a charcoal grey livery Maria did not recognise. The kind of carriage livery that spoke of an establishment large enough to maintain its own household colours, and precise enough in its maintenance to put them on a man delivering a letter to a cottage in a Yorkshire dale on a cold Tuesday. The letter was sealed with dark wax, impressed with a crest she did not immediately know, and addressed in a hand that conveyed authority through its very letter forms. Upright, unhurried, economical. To Miss Maria Oakshaw, Oakshaw Cottage, Aldenmere, Yorkshire. The Constance, Dowager Duchess of Eastmere, requested the pleasure of Miss Oakshaw's company at Northburn House, at the earliest possible convenience. The tone was that of a woman who understood that request and command occupied the same shelf, and had chosen the politer word as a matter of form rather than meaning. There was no explanation. There was no reference to any name Maria knew. There was only the address: Northburn, Holsworth, North Yorkshire. And the crest, and the unhurried hand, and the fact of the grey liveried messenger still waiting at the gate for her reply. Maria read the letter twice, folded it along its original creases, and stood for a moment in the kitchen, with the paper in her hand, and the particular stillness of someone assembling a picture whose parts have been present for some time, and whose arrangement has just, at last, declared itself. She sent back word that she would come on Friday. The carriage that arrived for her on Friday morning was the grey livery again, with a driver who handled the horses with the ease of long practice and offered no information about the journey or the destination beyond what was necessary for comfort. Maria sat inside with her hands in her lap and watched the North Riding unreal past the window, the limestone walls and the thorn hedges, and the long fall of the moors toward the horizon, and kept her own counsel. She saw Northburn before she arrived at it. It announced itself not with a gate or a lodge, but with a change in the quality of the land itself. A park that had been designed rather than simply inhabited. Its trees placed with intentions that had been made 100 years ago and had since grown into something indistinguishable from the natural. The house appeared at the end of a grass avenue 1/4 mile long, and it was not large in the way that threatening things are sometimes large. It was large in the way that time is large, the accumulation of stone and window and wing and consequence laid one upon another across several generations, until the whole constituted something that had its own weather, its own light, its own permanent claim on the landscape. 100 rooms, Maria thought, or something very near it. She counted the windows on the east face as they approached, and stopped counting at 47. The housekeeper, a steady woman named Mrs. Galt, who had the quality of a person who has managed difficult situations for a great many years and expects to manage several more, met her at the door and led her through corridors that had the cool, still air of rooms that are maintained rather than lived in. The air of a great house in November, when family has not yet arrived and the fires are laid but not yet lit in most of the rooms. Maria walked and counted. Not the windows now, but the clocks. She passed 7 of them in the first corridor alone. A tall case clock in oak. A bracket clock on a side table in dark walnut. A French or Molu piece above a fireplace she could not see into. Others at intervals down the passage, and not one of them in agreement with another. The oak case said 3:11. The walnut bracket said 4:25. The Ormolu Frenchman said something confident and wrong somewhere between the two. They ticked at each other across the corridor, with the serenity of objects that have long since ceased to expect resolution. Maria thought, without quite deciding to, this house has been arguing with itself for a very long time. She was shown to a room she would learn was called the Rose Room, though it had not contained roses since late September. A room of pale silk walls and good winter light from 2 tall windows, furnished with the unshowy solidity of things chosen for use rather than display. A fire. 2 chairs. A small table bearing a decanter and 2 glasses. And in the far chair, upright as a heron on a cold bank, a woman who looked as though she had spent 80 years declining to be impressed by anything, and had, on the whole, found this policy adequate. The Dowager Duchess of Eastmere was not a beautiful old woman. She had not, Maria suspected, been a beautiful young one. She had instead the look of a person whose face had been made, over decades, into an instrument of such precise expressiveness that beauty would have been redundant. A high-boned, hawk-nosed face, with dark eyes that moved quickly and missed nothing. Hands like the handles of very old silver, folded in her lap with the patience of a woman who has never needed to drum her fingers, because she has always known exactly how any given situation is going to end. She looked at Maria for a long and unembellished moment. Then she said, "You are exactly what I expected. Sit down, please." Maria sat. There was a quality to the instruction that made sitting seem less like compliance than the exercise of good sense. "I imagine," the Duchess said, "that you have worked out a portion of what I am about to tell you. You appear to be a woman who works things out." "I have worked out," Maria said, "that the man I stitched at Colley Ford is not a steward. He is the 9th Duke of Eastmere," the Duchess said, with the directness of a woman who has decided that the architecture of suspense is a luxury she cannot at present afford. "My grandson, Roland Ashworth. He has been a complete fool, and I have told him so, which is why he is in his study at this moment rather than in this room, because I sent him there while I spoke to you first. Because that is the correct order in which to conduct this conversation." Maria received this information with the outward composure she brought to emergencies, and it was only by virtue of a full 4 seconds of careful interior work that the outward composure was available. She had known, in the general way that one knows things one has not yet confirmed, that the gap between what Roland had said and what he was had been significant. She had not, precisely, assembled the specific shape of the gap until this moment. The 9th Duke of Eastmere. 11,000 acres, she would later learn. A house of 100 rooms. 15 years of precedence ahead of every man in this county, and a great many outside it. The man who had relayed her flagstone with a piece of flat shale and listened to Gilbert White by a kitchen fire. The Duchess watched her absorb it. She did not rush the process. He withheld his identity, Maria said. Her voice was level. She was proud of it. He did, the Duchess said. He did so because, and this is not an excuse, you understand, merely an explanation, he has spent 31 years being known, first and entirely, as what he is rather than who he is. And the fortnight in your kitchen was the first interval in his adult life when the opposite held true. He behaved with great selfishness and very little courage. He should have written to you weeks ago. He has not, because he is afraid of what you will think of him. Which is not a reason, but is, at least, an honest one. She paused. I am telling you this so that you do not hear it from him in a form that has been arranged for maximum effect. I find arranged truths irritating. So do I, Maria said. The Duchess made a small sound that might have been approval and reached for the decanter. What the Duchess told her next was this. Lady Deline Everley, a name Maria did not know, spoken by the Duchess with a careful neutrality that communicated precisely everything the Duchess thought of Lady Deline Everley, without requiring a single direct statement, had learned of the Duke's fortnight at Aldenmere. She had learned it through the machinery of county intelligence that operates on a principle Maria would come to understand as simply as gravity, that a Duke's private movements are never quite private. Lady Deline had been, by arrangement made when Roland was too young to have opinions about it, the expected future Duchess of Eastmere for 9 years. She had waited with diminishing patience and increasing visibility. She had decided that the proper use of this information was to distribute it, beginning with the most effective points of social distribution, as a characterization of Maria Oakshaw as the Duke's cast-off entertainment, a woman of no standing who had managed a fortnight's access and now required the family's discreet management. She has been thorough, the Duchess said. I will give her that. Maria sat with this for a moment. She looked at the pale silk walls of the Rose Room. She looked at the fire. She thought about the nameplate beside her door and what it meant, and what it would mean when the meaning of Collie Ford became the story that travelled the dale ahead of her for the rest of her life. What are you proposing? She asked. I am proposing a marriage, the Duchess said, with the directness that was apparently her only operating mode. Between you and my grandson, who is in the next room, and who, if you agree to hear him, will tell you that he wants it also. Not for the family's convenience, though I will be honest and say that the family's convenience is served by it, but because he has been in this house for 3 weeks and has been poor company, which is the available evidence of his feelings, and I have found it persuasive. I would want terms, Maria said. Written terms. The Duchess looked at her for a moment, with an expression that was not surprise. The Duchess, it was clear, had retired surprise from active service some years back, but was perhaps the closest thing to it that remained in her face's vocabulary. Then she said, Yes, that is what I expected you to say. That is also why you are exactly what I expected. Roland was brought from the study. He came in with the particular quality of a man who has been waiting in a condition of significant personal uncertainty and is not sure, arriving at the threshold whether what he is walking into is mercy or judgment or both. His face, when he saw Maria, did not arrange itself into anything calculated. It did the thing that faces do when they have spent weeks imagining a moment, and the moment is now present and the preparation is no longer useful. It showed what was underneath the preparation. He looked at her. She looked at him. The Duchess sat in her chair by the fire with her hands folded, watching them both with the serenity of a woman who has already decided how this ends, and is content to let the principals arrive at the same conclusion in their own time. He said her name. He said it the way he had said everything in that kitchen, plainly, without ornament, as though the word itself were the whole statement. She said, "Sit down. I want to hear it from you. All of it." He sat. He told her all of it. He was not, to his credit, artful about it. He did not arrange the confession for favourable effect, which was the one thing that might have made it worse than it already was. He told her about the journey, the reason for it, the accident, and the moment in her kitchen when he understood what it meant to be in a room where he was simply a man with a cut on his head and no further claims on anyone's expectations. He told her about the cowardice that had kept him from writing. Not the cowardice of cruelty, but the worst kind. The cowardice of someone who wants a thing so much that he has made himself unable to reach for it. His hands were clasped in his lap. He looked at her throughout. He did not look away. When he had finished, the room was quiet enough to hear the fire, and somewhere in the house beyond, the disagreeing tick of one of the corridor clocks. The oak case, she thought, with its slower beat. Maria said, "I will marry you. I will marry you on conditions that we write here and sign in front of your grandmother. I will not marry a duke. I will marry a man. And the conditions will say so, and if you cannot sign them, you cannot have me." The conditions took an hour to compose. On paper drawn from the writing table in the corner, in Maria's hand, clear and unhurried. The same hand that wrote in the account ledger, and the medical notes, and the letters to her father's old colleagues. 3 pages. The Duchess read each page as it was completed, and said nothing. Though once, near the end of the second page, something moved briefly across her face, and was gone. Roland read them. He held the pen for a moment over the final line, and looked up at Maria, and she met his eyes, and did not soften her expression, because the moment did not call for softening. It called for honesty. And she had enough of her father in her to know the difference. He signed. She signed beneath him. The Duchess added her name as witness, set down the pen, and looked at the document with the satisfied expression of a woman who has managed a complicated negotiation to a correct conclusion. Maria looked at the 3 signed pages on the table. Specific, cold, written in her own words, the ink still faintly wet, and felt the weight of what she had done settle on her shoulders. She had not married for love. She had married to keep her name, and her father's name, from being used as fodder for a story she had not written. That the man across the table looked at her the way he looked at her was a separate matter, and she was not yet prepared to let it be anything else. What she had not anticipated, what she could not have planned for, sitting in the rose room with the ink drying and the clocks disagreeing in the corridor outside, was the glimpse that arrived at the end of the hour. Roland reaching for the pages to fold them, and his thumb catching the corner of the paper, and the small reflex with which he pressed the fold down precisely, twice, exactly as she pressed the cord of her father's bag. The unconscious repetition of a person who has learned care from somewhere and cannot stop practicing it. She noticed it the way she noticed the pause before his name, the way she noticed everything, completely, without conclusion, filed in the part of her that kept accounts. The lamp on the writing table had burned low by the time the papers were put away. Mrs. Galt appeared at the door to show Maria to her room, and Maria rose and followed. And in the corridor, the clocks were all still disagreeing, and she counted 3 more of them between the Rose room and the stairs, still keeping no 2 times in common. And she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that a house which could not agree with itself about what hour it was might, in the right hands, be persuaded towards something more coherent. Her room was in the east wing, 2 floors up, with a window that faced the park and a fire that Mrs. Galt had lit before bringing her up, so that the room arrived at the right temperature for arrival, rather than requiring her to wait in the cold while it warmed. Maria set her bag on the low chest at the foot of the bed, her father's bag, which she had brought without quite deciding to, because there were things in it that she needed to have near her, and because the habit of readiness was not one she intended to suspend on account of a change in address, and stood at the window for a long moment looking at the park in the early dark, the grass avenue faint and silver in the last of the winter light, the avenue of trees standing at their stations on either side, with the patience of things that have been growing in the same place for 100 years, and have no particular objection to 100 more. She was the Duchess of Eastmere. She turned the fact over in her mind with the methodical attention she brought to unfamiliar diagnoses, examining it from each angle, pressing on it to see where it resisted, waiting to feel what it was actually made of. What it was made of, so far, was cold corridors and disagreeing clocks, and 3 pages of conditions in her own handwriting, and a man she had sent rabbit stew to, and then married for reasons that were defensible in law, if not yet in her own interior account. It was not a comfortable inventory. It was, however, an honest one, and she preferred honesty to comfort sufficiently that she had always chosen it when forced to choose. The house received her with the neutrality that large houses extend to newcomers, before deciding what to make of them. The staff was correct and professional, in the way of a household that has been well run for a long time, and understands that its own continuity depends on extending a consistent quality of service, regardless of changes at the top. But correctness is not warmth, and Maria was not the kind of person who mistook one for the other. And so she spent the first days at Northburn in the condition of someone who has been given a large, intricate instrument and told it is now hers, and who understands that there is a great deal to learn before she can play it with any confidence. She began where she always began, with what was concrete and useful. On her second morning, she asked Mrs. Galt for a tour of the house, a complete one, not the selective version offered to guests, but the full account, including the servants' stairs and the dairy and the estate office and the laundry. Mrs. Galt delivered it with the thoroughness of a woman who had been waiting, she sensed, to be asked. The tour took 3 hours. Maria learned the location of every clock in the building. There were 17, she confirmed by count. And by the end of the first week, she had observed that not one of them had ever been synchronized. And on the Thursday, she borrowed the key from the clock room and spent a morning in the corridor with her father's pocket watch, which kept correct time, and brought the 17 clocks into agreement with each other, for what Mrs. Galt confirmed, in an expression of measured astonishment, was probably the first time anyone had attempted it in living memory. Roland, observing this from the end of the corridor, said nothing. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and watched until she had wound the last one and set the pendulum, and then he said, "My grandfather bought the first 4 at an auction in '92 and could never remember which was correct, so he stopped choosing." "They are all correct now," Maria said. "I suggest a weekly account, or they'll drift again." He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said, "they will." This was how they inhabited the house together in those first weeks, in the margins of practical decisions, in the language of what needed doing and who would see to it. He had agreed, in the conditions, not to intrude upon her time or her domain without invitation. and he honoured this with a scrupulousness that she recognised as the particular scruple of a man who is afraid of making the same mistake twice. He kept to the east wing in the mornings. He was available for consultation at any hour, and made this known through Mrs. Galt, and through the straightforward expedient of being found, whenever Maria happened to pass the library, at the library table with whatever he was working on, his door open in the manner of a man who has decided that accessibility is the right policy. The door was always open. She noted it and said nothing. What he left her, he left without preamble. On the fourth day, she found her father's medical books in a fine mahogany case at the door of her room. 12 volumes, including the 2 she had sold after the funeral to cover a debt, bought back and rebound at the spine where they had worn. She stood in the doorway for a full minute looking at them without touching them, because there was something in the precision of the gesture, not a general gift but a specific retrieval, the exact books, the worn spines attended to, that required a full minute to absorb. She did not thank him that morning. She wrote him a note that evening in her account ledger hand, brief and accurate. She said she knew what he had done and understood its meaning, and she was grateful. She did not say more than that because more than that was not yet available to her to say with honesty. On the 7th day, he left a lamp at the arm of the library chair, a good reading lamp with a clean reservoir and a shade that directed light precisely downward on a page. She had mentioned, in passing, that the library light was inadequate for close work after dusk. She had mentioned it once. She had not expected it to be heard in the way that it was heard, as information about what she needed, and as an obligation to provide it. On the 9th day, she came down to the library in the evening, and he was there, at the far end of the table with the estate accounts open before him. And she sat in the chair with the new lamp and opened the natural history she had brought from Oakshore Cottage. And they spent 2 hours in the same room without requiring it to be more than that. And it was. She would not examine it then, only register it. The closest thing to the evenings in the kitchen that the house had yet produced. The estate, she learned, was a living thing, with the usual ailments of living things. Roofs that needed attention, drainage that had been deferred, a mill lease that required renegotiating, 3 tenant cottages in the North Quarter that should have been rethatched before the summer and had not been. She began visiting the tenant farms in the 2nd week, walking where the lanes were passable and taking the cob when they were not, carrying her father's bag as a matter of habit, and finding, as a matter of course, that the bag was required. It was at the Pelham farm, John and Sarah Pelham, 4 children, 120 upland acres, the kind of farm that was managed rather than farmed, sustained by effort rather than by land quality, that the first real thing happened. She had gone to look at the drainage ditch that was backing up into the lower paddock, because the estate office had a complaint from Pelham about it lodged in October that had not been resolved. She found Pelham at the paddock fence, and they talked about the ditch, and she made a note and said she would speak to the estate manager. And then Sarah Pelham appeared in the farmhouse doorway and said that if the Duchess had the time, she had wondered, privately, she didn't want to impose, but the youngest had had a fever for 3 days. The youngest was 14 months old, sitting on the kitchen floor with the slightly remote look of a child whose body is entirely engaged in fighting something it doesn't yet understand. Maria knelt on the flagstones without comment and opened the bag and worked through the examination with the full attention of someone for whom a child with a 3-day fever is a thing to be taken seriously and not managed with generalities. It was not, in the end, anything dangerous. The beginnings of an ear infection, the kind that required attention and warm oil and a specific instruction about what to watch for if the fever did not break by morning. She gave the instruction twice, once to Sarah and once, looking directly at her, a 3rd time to make sure it had been received. When she was pulling her coat back on, Sarah Pelham was looking at her with an expression that Maria recognised from a different context. the expression of someone who has been told something true about themselves by an unexpected source. They said in the village, Sarah began, and then stopped. I know what they said in the village, Maria said pleasantly. Warm oil, 3 drops, tilted on her left side for 10 minutes, twice a day. Come to Northburn if the fever goes above what I told you, and come at any hour. She walked back to the house in the thin December light with the bag on her arm, and the specific satisfaction of a correct diagnosis acted on. That afternoon she spoke to the estate manager, a competent man named Aldous Crane, who had been managing Northburn's lands for 11 years, and who received her assessment of the drainage situation with a respect that had been, she sensed, in the process of formation since approximately the moment he had heard about the examination at the Pelham farm. Word moved fast in a close estate. She understood this from her father's practice, and she understood it would work for her or against her, and she intended to give it the better option. It was Crane who told her, without editorialising, that Lady Deline Everleigh had been the guest of the Marchioness of Stanley at the Assembly Rooms in Ripon the previous Tuesday, and had made a remark, received with some laughter by part of the company, to the effect that while the new Duchess of Eastmere might be very competent at lancing boils, she could not hold a fan in company. Crane delivered this information with the neutrality of a man who has decided that the Duchess requires accurate intelligence and that providing it is part of his professional obligation. He watched her face as he said it. Her face did nothing useful or interesting, which was the best face she had available. "Thank you, Crane," she said. "The drainage ditch north of Pelham's paddock. I want it cleared before Christmas. Can it be done?" Crane said it could. She left the estate office and walked down the long corridor toward the stairs and past the oak case clock, which was keeping correct time, and paused in front of it for a moment and breathed carefully. Because Lady Deline Everleigh was a subject that required careful breathing, before it could be dealt with from a position of any use. She had known the name since the Rose Room, since the Duchess had spoken it with that precise and instructive neutrality. She knew its full dimensions now. 9 years of expectation, the cradle betrothal, the waiting. She did not, because she was constitutionally incapable of willful cruelty, allow herself to simplify Deline Everleigh into a villain. A woman who had waited 9 years in good faith and been set aside for a contingency the waiting could not have anticipated, was on her own terms a figure with a legitimate grievance. That the response to that grievance had been a campaign of social diminishment did not change what lay underneath it. Maria had learned from years of accurate diagnosis that behaviour was always downstream of something, and that the something was almost always fear. She did not share this analysis with anyone. She filed it beside the other careful accountings and went upstairs and changed her boots and came back down for dinner. The young maid who did the bedroom fires was named Bess Elizabeth Hartley, 17, from a village 12 miles east, sent into service the previous spring by a mother who had 4 more children and limited options. Bess had the character of someone for whom the great house was still, 4 months in, a source of a low-grade and continuous alarm. She moved through the corridors with the specific carefulness of a person who is afraid that something will break if she is not careful enough, and not entirely sure whether the something she is afraid of breaking is the house's contents or herself. She was competent at her work, Maria had observed this, but she performed her competence with a tension in her shoulders that Maria recognised as the tension of someone who has been told, by circumstance rather than by any particular person, that she does not quite belong where she is. Maria began, in the way she began everything, with what was concrete. She had occasion one morning to be in the upstairs hall when Bess was laying the fire, and she sat down on the window seat and watched, and Bess went very still in the way that junior servants go still when they are unexpectedly observed by someone of authority and are calculating what they might have done wrong. "Come here a moment," Maria said. Bess came, cautiously. "Give me your wrist," Maria said. Either one. Bess offered her left wrist, with the slightly glazed expression of someone who has no idea what is about to happen and is too well trained to say so. Maria found the pulse point and pressed 2 fingers to it and held them there. "Feel that," she said. "Count it. 1 for each beat. That is the pulse." Bess counted, silently, with her lips moving slightly. "It's fast," she said, with some surprise. "You're nervous," Maria said. "It goes faster when you're nervous. It also goes faster with fever, with pain, with fear, and with effort. Slower in rest and in some illnesses. Learning to count it accurately is the first thing anyone learns, and it costs nothing and takes a week of practice." She released the wrist. "Practice on yourself this week. Come find me on Friday and tell me what you've learned." Bess looked at her with the expression of someone receiving an unexpected gift from an unexpected source, and not yet certain whether the gift is real. "Friday," Maria confirmed, and went back to her own morning. By the second Friday, Bess could take a resting pulse accurately. By the end of December, she could identify the difference between a fast pulse from nerves and a fast pulse from the beginnings of fever. The quality of it, the regularity, the way it ran under the fingers. And the tension in her shoulders had acquired, if not ease exactly, something slightly more like the confidence of someone who has been given a tool they know how to use and has therefore been given a small, reliable territory in the world that belongs to them. She still moved through the corridors carefully. She was less afraid of what she might break. The library evenings became a habit before either of them named it as such, which was the way the best habits formed, by accretion rather than decision. It began as an occasional overlap, Maria reading after dinner, Roland at the far end of the table with his own work. It became a regular arrangement, unspoken, acknowledged only by the fact that if one of them arrived first, they left the fire built up, because someone else was coming. He read Cooper aloud on Tuesday evenings when the accounts were finished, in the same measured register he had used in the kitchen, unhurried, unperformative, as though the words were simply available for whoever wanted them. She wrote in the ledger, or the medical notes, or, occasionally, a letter to one of her father's colleagues, with whom she had begun a correspondence about a particularly difficult case of tertian fever she had encountered at the Deaston farm. It was on one of those evenings, 3 weeks into the new year, that he began to talk about his childhood. Not abruptly, and not as a confession, more in the way that the evenings in the kitchen had worked. A door opened slightly, an offering made, waiting to see whether the offering would be accepted or left on the step. He said, looking at the fire rather than at her, that his father had been a man who understood the succession completely, and his son barely at all. Not from malice, he was careful to say, but from the particular narrowness of a man whose entire sense of purpose had collapsed into a single function, and who saw in his heir only the future execution of that function. He said his mother had died when he was 9, which was when the narrowness in his father had completed its final contraction into something that left very little room for anything except inheritance, an obligation, and correct public behaviour. He said these things simply, as reported facts, with the same quality Maria had observed in his confession in the Rose Room, an absence of arrangement. "You said, in the kitchen," Maria said, when he had been quiet for a moment, "that you were tired of being known as what you were rather than who you were." "Yes," he said. "And now?" She looked at the fire as he was looking at it, so that neither of them was required to manage the conversation's weight through eye contact. A long pause. The clock in the corner, she had synchronized them all, and this one kept its time, counted out 12 slow beats. "Now," he said, "I am trying to find out who that is. It is slower work than I expected, because I have not had a great deal of practice. Maria looked down at her ledger. The entry for that day read, in her account hand, 3 visits, 1 minor wound, Bess progressing well, drainage resolved. She said, "Most worthwhile work is slow." He turned to look at her then, and she felt the look without meeting it, and the fire moved in the grate, and the clock continued. The specific rumour reached Northburn through the village of Holsworth in the 3rd week of January, passed along a chain of county communication with the efficiency that characterised information about the ducal family in this part of the riding. It arrived in a version that had been refined, by passage, to its most effective form. That Lady Deline Everleigh had repeated, at 3 separate gatherings now, the account of the fortnight at Aldenmere, and had added, in each subsequent telling, a new detail of colouring, each detail small, each one plausible, each one cumulatively steering the story toward a single interpretation. Maria had been, in this telling, a calculated opportunist. The fortnight had been an arrangement of convenience. The Duke had not been a man lost in a flood, but a man who had arrived at the cottage with purpose, and had been expertly managed from the bag to the banns. Maria heard this version from the Duchess, who had heard it from a cousin in the West Riding, who had been at the most recent gathering. And the Duchess delivered it with the same precise neutrality she brought to everything unpleasant, which was to say, with no neutrality at all, since her neutrality was itself a quality so pointed that it functioned as its own judgment. "She has been thorough," Maria said. The Duchess made the same sound she had made in the Rose Room. "She is frightened," Maria said, because she had been thinking about it for 3 weeks and was now ready to say so. A frightened person with 9 years of investment and a specific kind of pride will do thorough work. The Duchess looked at her for a moment, with the quick, dark eyes that missed nothing. "You are more charitable than I expected," she said. "I am not charitable," Maria said. "I am accurate. They are different things." Roland knew the rumour too. She understood this, though he did not raise it directly, because the quality of his presence in the days after it arrived at Northburn had the specific quality of a man carrying something he has decided he must deal with and has not yet determined how. She watched this from the distance the conditions permitted her and did not reach across it, because that distance was hers as much as his, and she was not prepared to surrender it on the basis of a rumour, even this one. But on a Thursday evening in late January, sitting in the library with the lamp casting its clean circle on the table between them, he set down the cowper and looked at her directly, in the way he had looked at her in the kitchen on the night he had spoken about the Swifts. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to know that I am not telling it to manage what you think of me. I am telling it because you have a right to know it, and because I am done with the cowardice of not saying what ought to be said." Maria set down her pen. She looked at him. "I know what Deline is saying. I know what it costs you. And I know it is my fault that it costs you anything at all, because I put you in the position that makes the saying of it possible." He was looking at her with the steadiness that was his particular quality, not defiance and not apology, but the steadiness of someone who has worked out what is true and has arrived at it at some cost to himself. "I cannot undo the fortnight. I would not undo it, but the cost of it should be mine, and it has become yours, and that is not something I am willing to leave unaddressed." The lamp between them held its clean and steady light. Maria looked at her hands, then at him. "I know," she said. "I know you would not undo it." It was the first time she had offered him that. She saw it land in his face the way the 3 words had landed in the kitchen, not with noise, but with the specific weight of something that has travelled a long distance to arrive at exactly the right place. The London season came early that year, announced not by any official decree but by the particular quality of movement that began in January in the great houses of the north. The packing of trunks, the forwarding of correspondence, the gradual gravitational pull of the capital that asserted itself each year with the reliability of a tide. The Duchess had taken a house in Cavendish Square for February, and Roland's presence in London was required for a bill before the Lords that concerned drainage rights along 3 rivers in the north, a matter of some practical importance, as Maria noted when she read the summary, since 2 of those rivers ran through the Eastmere estate. She was invited to accompany. She came. London was not, as it turned out, a different country, though she had expected it to feel like one. It was instead a more concentrated version of the same human material she already knew. People arranged in hierarchies, managing information strategically, wanting things they could not straightforwardly ask for, and finding the gap between what they showed and what they were in various states of tension. What was different was the volume, not the noise, though that was considerable, but the volume of everything, the density of social obligation, the speed at which information moved, the number of people with a position to maintain, and the corresponding precision of the instruments they used to maintain it. She was inspected. She understood this and submitted to it with the patience of someone who has been inspected before, by the Dale, by the Tennant Farms, by Mrs. Galt on that first morning, by the corridor of disagreeing clocks, and who understands that inspection is merely the mechanism by which unfamiliar things are made familiar, and that the correct response to it is to be exactly what one is and allow the inspecting party to reach its own conclusions. Some of those conclusions were favourable. Lady Hartfield, who held a position of some social authority in the circles the Eastmere title moved through, encountered Maria at a musical evening at the Cavendish House and asked her, with the directness of a woman who had spent 60 years earning the right to it, about the drainage problem at Pelham Farm, which she had heard about through a connection in Harrogate. Maria told her. Lady Hartfield listened without interrupting, which was her own version of approval, and by the end of the conversation had twice used the word sensible, with a warmth that transformed it into something considerably stronger. Others were less favourable, or withheld their conclusions entirely, or offered them in forms that required translation from the original social cipher. This Maria managed. She had translated difficult patients her whole life, and the grammar of avoidance was consistent across registers. Lady Deline Everleigh appeared at a ball at Lord Farrington's house on a Wednesday evening in the 3rd week of February. Maria knew she would be there, Roland had told her, plainly, on the morning of the ball, because he had decided that plain information was the policy he intended to keep. He had also said, with the same plainness, that he would remain close and that she was not required to manage anything alone. She had thanked him and said that she was capable of managing her own encounters, and he had said yes, he knew, and the conversation had settled at that. Deline Everleigh was a tall woman, dark-haired, with the kind of beauty that announces itself clearly and expects this to constitute sufficient grounds for most ordinary negotiations. She moved through the rooms with a confidence that had been decades in the making, and that Maria, as a matter of accurate observation, recognised as genuine rather than performed. This was not a woman who had needed to practice confidence. It was a woman who had been given it by circumstance, and had worn it so long it was indistinguishable from character. She found Maria near the refreshment table in the second room. Maria had been standing with a cup of something warm that was not quite tea, watching 2 elderly gentlemen conduct a negotiation that involved a great deal of gesturing at a painting of a horse. And she was aware of Deline's approach before Deline was aware that she was aware, which was the small, quiet advantage of being a person who watched things carefully in preference to being watched. The cup of not quite tea went first. It happened with the plausible efficiency of an accident, a movement through the press of bodies, an arm extended at the wrong moment, a tilt, a splash. The pale liquid caught the front of Maria's silk gown, a deep blue that had been Roland's quiet contribution to the London wardrobe, chosen without consultation on the grounds, she suspected, that he knew what colour suited her and had decided to act on it, and spread with the unhurried certainty of damage already done. Deline's expression performed surprise with the precision of long practice. "How dreadful," she said. "How terribly clumsy. I am so sorry." Maria looked at her dress, then at Deline, and had 3 full seconds, which was, in her experience, sufficient time to make most important decisions, to choose what to do with the 3 seconds. What she did not do. Show anything that could be called distress. What she did not do. Respond to the performed apology with either acceptance or accusation. What she did, in those 3 seconds, was complete the calculation she had begun in January when she had said to the Duchess that Deline Everley was frightened, and confirm it. The precision of the gesture was not the precision of malice, it was the precision of desperation. And desperation and malice were neighbours, but they were not the same address. She was still holding this understanding when Roland arrived at her side. He had seen it from across the room, she would learn this afterward, from the quality of the speed with which he had moved. He came to stand beside her, with the particular stillness of a man who is very angry and has chosen, completely and deliberately, not to be angry in public. He looked at Maria first, a single assessing look, and then at Deline. And what he brought to bear on Lady Deline Everley was not fury. Fury would have given her something to work with, but a cold and impeccable dignity that occupied the space around them like a dropped temperature. Lady Deline, he said. His voice was entirely level. I believe you know my wife. The possessive was not a claim. It was a fact, stated with the quality of something that has always been true and requires no further support. Deline's composed expression held for a beat and then, at its margins, showed the very edge of something she had not intended to show. Maria looked at her directly, and what she saw in those margins was what she had been looking for since January. The fear behind the performance, clean and specific and human. The fear of a woman who had organised 9 years around a certainty and had the certainty removed. I must go and change, Maria said, to Roland and to no one else in particular, and her voice was entirely mild. Would you excuse me for a moment? He handed her his handkerchief, plain white linen, his initials in one corner, the fabric worn to a softness that meant it had been used and laundered many times. The handkerchief of someone who actually carried one, and not of someone for whom it was ornament. She took it, pressed it once to the stain with the brisk practicality of someone who knows the stain is already done, and the pressing is symbolic, and then looked back at Deline. There is no need to apologise again, she said. These things happen. She said it simply, without warmth and without coldness, as a plain statement of fact. She went out. She was in the corridor for perhaps 2 minutes, finding a glass of water and applying the handkerchief to the silk with the mechanical attention of useful work, before Roland appeared. He did not look relieved to find her composed. He looked at her steadily, with an expression that was somewhere in the territory of what she had seen in the kitchen after Robin Sowerby's splinter. "Are you all right?" he said. Not a question quite. More the specific inquiry of someone who needs an accurate answer and is prepared to wait for it rather than accept the first available one. "I'm perfectly all right," she said. "I want you to know something, and I want you to know it now, while it is fresh and before either of us has had time to manage it." She looked at him directly, in the way she had looked at him across the kitchen fire when she had told him he was not raised to be a steward. "I do not need rescuing. I understand that you came across the room because you wanted to, and I am not ungrateful for it. But the moment was mine to manage, and I managed it. And I want that to be understood between us." Something shifted in his face. Not retreat, something more like the look of a man hearing his own language spoken back to him and recognising it. "It is understood," he said. "Good," she said. "Then we can go back in." They went back in. Lady Deline Everley was not found again in their immediate vicinity for the remainder of the evening, which was a social fact that Maria noted with neither satisfaction nor triumph, only the mild accuracy with which she noted most things. Roland's handkerchief remained in her possession. She had no particular reason to return it immediately, and she did not. They returned to Northburn in the first week of March, when the London business was concluded, and the North pulled them back with the specificity of a place that is actually home. The dale was beginning, at its margins, to show the early indications of spring. Not warmth yet, but the precise withdrawal of winter's insistence. A little more light at the edges of the morning, a change in the quality of the mud on the lane, the first definitive sounds from the rookery in the ash trees above Collie Ford. Maria stood on the road near the ford on the morning after their return, looking at the stones of the crossing in the clear, low water of a dry season, and tried to find, in the ordinary appearance of the place, the correspondence between what it looked like now and what it had looked like on the night she had brought her lantern down this lane and found a man in dark clothes bleeding against a road bank. She found it, and she held it for a moment, and then she walked back to Northburn, because there was work. The dinner at Northburn was Roland's idea, or rather, it was the natural consequence of an obligation that the estate's social position imposed once per year. The gathering of the county families, a thing that had been done by the Dukes of Eastmere for 120 years, and that this Duke had continued, with the slight modifications of a man who finds the form necessary, but not the specific details sacrosanct. Maria had helped plan it, the menu, the seating, the sequence of rooms. She had done so with her characteristic methodicalness, treating the logistics of a dinner for 40 as she treated a complex medical case. All variables in their places, contingencies accounted for, nothing left to the hope that it would simply resolve. She had not, until 2 days before, known that Lady Deline Everley would be in attendance. This information arrived through Roland, who had looked at the additions to the guest list, the work of his steward, who had issued standing invitations to certain county families as a matter of form, and had come to find her with the specific quality of a man who has found something that requires immediate disclosure. She already knew when she saw his face. She said, "Deline." "Invited by standing list," he said. "I can." "No," she said. "Leave it." He looked at her. "Leave it," she said again. "I know what I am doing." What she was doing was something she had been working towards since January, since the precise moment she had said to the Duchess that Deline Everley was frightened, and that frightened people with specific kinds of pride do thorough work. She had been doing the arithmetic of it for 6 weeks. She had arrived at a conclusion that was not strategy in the cold sense, not a move calculated for advantage, but something more like the application of an accurate diagnosis. You did not treat fear with counterattack. You treated fear by removing the thing it was afraid of. The evening arrived. 40 guests. The house was warm in the way it had not been warm since Maria's arrival. All 17 clocks keeping their common time. The fires laid in every room, including the rooms usually kept dark. The corridors smelling of pine resin and good beeswax candles. And something from the kitchen that Mrs. Trevik, summoned from Aldenmere for the occasion, had been producing since morning. It had been Maria's idea to bring Mrs. Trevik. Roland had not questioned it. Mrs. Trevik had arrived with the equanimity of a woman who has always known, at some level, that her cooking was suited to larger stages. Maria wore the deep blue silk again, repaired by Bess with a skill that had surprised them both. The small, pale mark of the stain's former presence barely visible in the candlelight, and not visible at all unless you were looking for it. She had known what she was doing in choosing it. The knowing was not defiance exactly. It was accuracy. This was the gown, and the occasion required it. And accuracy was not a quality she suspended for social convenience. Deline Everley arrived with the Marchioness of Stanley in the 8th carriage of the evening, which Maria observed from the top of the stairs in the manner of a woman who has decided that knowing the order of arrival is useful information rather than anxious intelligence gathering. She watched Deline enter the hall with the self-possession of her established confidence and look up once, as people do when they enter a room and want to take its measure, and find Maria at the top of the stairs, composed and still. Whatever Deline had expected, Maria thought, it had not been stillness. The evening moved through its formal stages with the architecture that such evenings have maintained for longer than any person in the room had been alive. Drinks in the drawing room, dinner at the long table, the movement of conversation through its socially obligatory stations, and then, gradually, into the looser registers of a room where the food has been good and the wine has been adequate, and people have begun to remember that they are, after all, neighbours. It was at dinner that it happened. The table had found its conversational current, and Maria was speaking with Sir Edmund Whitmore, a magistrate of some standing, and a man of the practical, land-owning variety, who asked intelligent questions and received intelligent answers with the satisfaction of someone who had not expected the new Duchess to have any. When Lady Deline, 2 seats down and across, said into a pause in the general table conversation, said it clearly, with the carrying clarity of a woman who had rehearsed the timing, if not the exact words, that it was, she thought, quite remarkable how the circumstances of the marriage had come about. A fortnight alone, and before a proper introduction had been made. One quite understood how such things could develop. One wondered what the county made of it. The table paused. Maria set down her fork. She did it without hurry and with the deliberateness that signalled to anyone watching that what followed was intentional and not reactive. She looked at Deline across the candles and the silver and the good white cloth, and the 40 people who were now, collectively, and with various degrees of discretion, attending to the same exchange. She told the story. She told it simply, in the order in which it had happened, without embellishment. The flooded dale, the broken bridge, Mrs. Trevick's report of a carriage over at Collie Ford. She told it the way she would have told a medical history. Each fact placed in sequence, each detail specific. The mud on the lane, Harker's shoulder, the curved needle, the rain on the roof. A man who gave only a Christian name and accepted rabbit stew without complaint, and relayed a flagstone and listened to natural history by a kitchen fire. She did not editorialise. She did not invite the table to a conclusion. She offered the facts and left them on the cloth for the company to look at. And the company looked. He was a man who needed a doctor, she said, and I was the doctor who was available. Everything else that followed from that, and I've never been ashamed of it, and I do not expect to begin. The table was quiet for a moment, with the specific quality of quiet that follows something true said plainly in company. And then Sir Edmund Whitmore laughed. A real laugh. The spontaneous variety, the kind that arrives before its owner has decided whether to allow it, and said that in 30 years on the bench he had heard a great many statements of fact, and that was among the finest he had encountered. And he raised his glass. The table moved. Several conversations began at once. The current returned. Maria picked up her fork. She looked once at Roland, who was at the far end of the table, and found that he was already looking at her with an expression she had been learning to read across many evenings and many registers and many versions of Firelight. He did not raise his glass. He looked at her the way he had looked at her across the kitchen from the day she had asked him whether being unknown was useful, and found out the answer was yes. She looked back at her plate. 2 seats down and across, Deline Everleigh's face had undergone a change that would not have been visible to most people at the table, but was visible to Maria, who had been watching for it for 6 weeks, and knew exactly what she was looking for. The composure was intact, the performance was intact, but the thing behind the performance, the specific fear that Maria had diagnosed in January and treated, tonight, by the method of removing its occasion, had shifted. Not disappeared, shifted into something less weaponized. The expression of a woman who had thrown everything she had at a target and found the target still standing, and who was, at some deep and involuntary level, in the process of understanding that she was done. After dinner, when the company had distributed itself between the drawing rooms and the gallery, and the conversation had found its various natural channels, Maria found herself alone, in the short corridor between the dining room and the east drawing room. Alone for perhaps 3 minutes, in the specific solitude of a large party that creates, in its movement from room to room, small, temporary voids of quiet. She stood in the corridor and she breathed. And the corridor was cool after the warmth of the dining room. And the oak case clock at the far end beat its slow and steady count. She heard his step before she saw him, the specific weight and measure of it, the step she had first registered in the mud of the lane at Collie Ford, moving behind her toward the cottage. He came around the corner from the east drawing room and stopped when he saw her there, alone in the corridor, in the blue silk and the candlelight. And they stood 6 feet apart, in the quiet that was not quiet, but was the particular near quiet of a house full of people who were elsewhere. "You were magnificent," he said. "I was accurate," she said. "They are different things." The corner of his mouth moved. She had spent months learning that movement and understanding what it contained. "Maria," he said. She waited. He crossed the corridor in 3 steps. Not quickly, not as though he were afraid she would disappear, but with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has finally, completely decided. And he said, "I have never loved anyone until you found me in that ditch. I need you to know that. Not as a statement designed to accomplish anything, as a fact." The corridor clock counted between them. "I know," she said. "I want." He stopped. The usual steadiness was present, but underneath it something that was not quite steadiness, the seam showing. "I want to ask you properly. Not as an arrangement, not as conditions signed in front of a witness, as a man to a woman. If you would have me." She looked at him for a long time in the candlelight. She looked at him the way she looked at difficult things, directly and without flinching, and with the understanding that what she found would require her to act on it. She said, "Ask me." He did. He said her name first, and then he asked, in words that were plain and unornamented, and that she would not repeat to anyone, and did not need to, because they had landed in the place where things that are true land when they are finally said aloud, and they would keep. She said yes. She did not say it quickly or slowly. She said it with the specificity of a decision made out of full knowledge, the kind of yes that has no qualifications hiding behind it. She said it once. It was enough. He held out his hand, palm up, in the posture not of a man taking, but of a man offering. The same gesture, she thought, with the part of her mind that continued to observe even in the middle of the things it was observing, as the gesture of someone who has decided that openness is the only policy he will practice from this point forward. She set her hand in his. The corridor was cool, and outside the March wind was moving through the ash trees. And somewhere in the east drawing room a woman was playing the pianoforte with more confidence than skill, and the oak case clock at the end of the corridor counted its slow and reliable measure, keeping the hour as it had been asked to keep it, as it would go on keeping it, because someone had finally, in this house that had argued with itself for too long, attended to what needed attending to, and had found it was capable of something steadier than it had managed alone. The party completed itself the way good parties do. Gradually, without crisis, the rooms emptying by degrees as the evening's energy expended itself into good conversation and the particular warmth of a house that has been genuinely inhabited for a night rather than merely used. Maria returned to the east drawing room with her hand released and her expression arranged into the composure that she had learned at Northburn was not the mask it had once seemed, but simply the outer form of a person who has more interior weather than she shows in company. Roland was at the far end of the room within 2 minutes, and she felt the specific quality of the near distance between them, not the contractual distance of the conditions, which had already been dissolving for weeks without her having formally acknowledged it, but something more like the ordinary proximity of two people who have agreed, quietly and without ceremony, on where they stand. She was crossing back toward the dining room when she found Deline. Not sought her, found her. The gallery ran the length of the east wing on the upper floor, and Maria had gone up to check whether the fire in the end bedroom had been kept stoked for the two guests staying the night. And she came out of the bedroom corridor into the gallery, and Deline was there, alone, standing at the far window with her back to the room, and one hand against the glass and the other at her side. And the particular set of her shoulders was nothing like the shoulders that had carried Lady Deline Everleigh through 30 years of society with such consistent and visible confidence. These were the shoulders of someone standing inside a room that has just had all its furniture removed. Maria could have turned. The door behind her was still open, the sound of the party below still audible in the stairwell, and Deline had not heard her over it. She did not turn. She came to stand at the near end of the gallery, 12 feet from the window, and said, at a conversational volume that would carry to Deline, but no further, "The fire in the third bedroom will need building up before the Whitmore party retires. I can send Bess." Deline turned. Her face, in the low light of the gallery's 2 candle sconces, had shed the composed surface she wore in company, the way a face sheds its composure when it believes it is unobserved. Not collapsed into ugliness, nothing so dramatic, that simplified. The beauty was still there. Underneath it was something much younger than the beauty, something with the raw, abraded quality of a feeling that has been held under pressure for a very long time. "Why are you speaking to me about a bedroom fire?" Deline said. Her voice was level. The levelness cost her something visible. "Because it is what I came up here to attend to," Maria said. "And you happen to be here." A silence. Below, someone at the pianoforte had stopped mid-phrase and not started again. "You have won," Deline said. The flatness of it was not defeat as Maria recognized defeat. Not the collapse of someone who has given up, but the exhaustion of someone who has been running a very long race and has finally, at the finish, allowed her legs to do what they have been asking to do for miles. You could conduct yourself with a great deal more satisfaction about it than you are conducting yourself. "I have not won anything," Maria said. "There was nothing to win. There was a man in a ditch and I was a doctor. And I went out in the storm. That is all there was. And everything that came from it came from that." Deline looked at her with the dark, quick eyes that were her own most accurate feature. Eyes that had never, Maria suspected, been fully employed in the service of what the mouth was saying. "He would not have looked at me the way he looks at you," she said. "He never would have. I understood that this summer, before your name was known anywhere. I understood it from the way he came back from the north." Maria said nothing. This was not, she had learned, an absence of response. Sometimes not speaking was the most accurate response available, because speaking would have required her to manage Deline's feelings for her, and that was not what Deline needed. What Deline needed was to say this to someone who would simply receive it, cleanly, as the true thing it was. "I was very angry," Deline said. "I was not. I want you to understand that I was not wrong to be angry. I want someone to understand that." "I do understand it," Maria said. 9 years is a long time to hold something that you were given in good faith." The window glass showed the black March sky and the faint reflection of the 2 candle sconces, and Deline's profile in the glass had the quality of something looking at itself and finding it no longer entirely recognizable. "You are very difficult to hate properly," Deline said, and there was something in it that was almost, in its unexpected territory, a kind of rueful humour. The humour of a woman discovering that the person she has decided to despise is insufficiently obliging about it. I have been told that before, Maria said. Mostly by patients who wanted to be more difficult than their conditions permitted. She paused. Go back to the party, Lady Deline. Not because I am asking you to, but because you will feel better with people around you than alone in a gallery. And there is good wine left. And Sir Edmund Whitmore has been looking for someone who will argue seriously with him about sheep rotation. Deline looked at her for a long moment. Then, in a movement so small it might not have registered as the thing it was, a slight loosening about the jaw, a release of something that had been held at cost. She turned from the window. She went down the stairs. Maria stood alone in the gallery for a moment, with the cool air and the candle sconces and the March sky in the glass. And then she sent Bess to attend to the bedroom fire and went back to her party. Spring arrived properly in April, and with it the return of the Swifts to the east face of Northburn. Roland had told her about them, in the kitchen in the second week of the flood, and she had been watching for them since March. They came back to the exact stones, as he had said they would, with the certainty of things that have kept faith with a particular place across a very long distance. She watched them from the library window on the morning they arrived and did not call for anyone, because the watching felt like a private thing, a small accounting between herself and a story she was still writing. She had moved her father's bag from the bedroom chest to the lower shelf beside the kitchen door at Northburn, the shelf she had asked the estate carpenter to build at the correct height. The height of a person who could grab it without bending. The height her father had built his shelf. The bag sat there through the spring and into the summer, its brass clasp still not catching, the waxed cord still tied an inch tighter for the wet. It had been used at least once a week since she had arrived. Northburn's tenants had ceased, by April, to look surprised when the Duchess arrived at their kitchen doors with the ox-hide bag on her arm. Bess, by midsummer, could take a pulse in the dark. The conditions in their mahogany-framed case in the library remained signed and witnessed and accurate, because accuracy did not require amendment simply because circumstances had shifted. But a document that had once felt like the boundary of a territory had become, by degrees that neither of them had formally annotated, something more like the record of an earlier version of a conversation that had since been continued in many subsequent rooms, and was no longer primarily about the things the original had needed to establish. He called her Maria, always. She had begun, somewhere in the spring, to call him Roland. Not consistently, not by decision. She had simply noticed one morning that she had done it, and that it had felt correct. The way correct things feel when they have been true for a while, before being named. They did not have the kind of easy marriage that appears in stories as an ending. They had a working one, sometimes difficult, occasionally misaligned, periodically requiring the same directness in its private version that Maria had always brought to its public one. He had, twice, defaulted to managing things without telling her, which was the old habit of a man whose training had been all authority and no disclosure. And twice she had told him plainly what that cost and what she needed. And twice he had listened with the steadiness that was his particular and permanent quality. She had, once, put the ledger between them, when she should have put it down and looked at him. And he had waited for her to notice this with a patience that communicated, precisely and without accusation, that he had noticed before she had. A marriage that requires two people to keep working at it is, her father had once told her, on a different subject, in a different context, in the kitchen at Oakshaw Cottage on a winter evening long before any of this. Exactly the kind worth having. 3 years after the flood at Collie Ford, in November, the rain came back. It came with the same character it had brought the first time. Out of the north, purposeful. With the specific quality of weather that knows it is going to stay a while, and has arranged itself accordingly. By the second night, the beck was up past its stones, and the lower fields were dark with standing water, and the road to the village ran the colour of the cold sky reflected. Maria heard it on the roof of the Rose Room, the same room, her room now, familiar in every corner and in every piece of its pale silk, which she had come to find less like emptiness and more like a particular quality of quiet. And she woke at the sound of it, the way she had always woken at bad weather, with the immediate alertness of a person whose profession has always required being awake when the weather called. She rose and lit the candle on the table by the window and stood at the glass. The park was invisible past the first line of trees. The avenue had disappeared. The rain on the glass ran in the continuous grey sheets she knew, and the candle flame held steady in the warm room behind her. And she watched the dark and the water without knowing quite what she was looking for. Not the carriage this time, not an emergency, nothing that required the bag or the curved needle, only the looking itself, the old reflex of someone who had grown up watching bad weather from lit windows and assessing what it required. She heard his step in the corridor, the specific weight and measure of it, unmistakable after 3 years. And then the door. And Roland came in without speaking, and came to stand behind her at the window. His hands found her shoulders. He had, in 3 years of marriage, developed the particular accuracy of a man who knows where a person's specific tensions live and what they require. And his hands went there without ceremony, the way useful things in this house had always simply been put where they were needed. In the glass, she could see the room behind them, the fire, the table, the small reading lamp, the open ledger on the chair, her father's bag on its shelf by the door, the waxed cord catching the firelight. She set her right hand over his left, where it rested on her shoulder. The plain gold ring on his finger was warm, worn to the faint polish of a thing that is never removed. Simple gold, no stone, chosen by the same instinct that had built the library shelf at the right height, that had relayed the flagstone with a piece of flat shale, that had listened to natural history by a kitchen fire without performing the act of listening. The candle burned between her and the dark glass. "There's always a light," she said, watching the rain. "You only have to be the sort who will go out in the storm to find the person carrying it." Outside, the rain fell. Inside, the candle held.